joined as always by my co-host Andre Ganuela. And today we are thrilled to be joined by Russ Travers, who spent over 40 years serving around the US government in a variety of positions, more three-letter acronyms than I can even list out right now. But I do want to mention two crucial ones. He was the acting director of the National Counterterrorism Center, and most recently he served on the National Security Council as the Deputy Homeland Security Advisor to President Biden. We're going to spend a lot of today's conversation talking about the Special Immigrant Visa program, which Russ basically oversaw and worked a lot on during his time on the National Security Council. I know that wasn't what he went there to do, but he did do quite a good job, and so I'm looking forward to talking to him about that. And without further ado, Russ, I do want to begin by talking about counterterrorism, basically an overview of the threat matrix, because you spent most of your career in counterterror. And so the first question, has the terror threat decreased in the past few years? We've seen this pivot to Asia. Is that kind of impacting how we evaluate and view this threat of terrorism?
Well, first, thanks very much for having me. The terrorism threat has evolved, to be sure. If you just look back over the last couple of weeks, we saw, I think, 3 suicide bombings outside the parliament in Uganda. We saw something in a Liverpool hospital. And even in the United States, a couple of weeks ago, we had warnings of a threat out in Tyson's Corner. But the evolution has been pretty significant. From after 9/11, it was largely a focused hierarchical external ops from the Afghan-Pak border. We then saw sort of a franchising of Al-Qaeda. We began to see a little bit of the homegrown violent extremism play out. We saw Al-Qaeda in Iraq become ISIS and the Caliphate and major external attacks, and then a lot more homegrown violent extremism. And then we saw a significant uptick in domestic terrorism. Certainly, it's a diminished threat in that, at least for the time being, we're seeing far less large-scale operations. I think we need to be careful in terms of looking now as opposed to looking 4, 5, 6 years down the road. And that's why I will often talk about my concern about complacency, because this is a tough issue for the intelligence and law enforcement community to begin with. On the Islamist side, I am a fan of David Cullen's sort of global insurgency notion, and that helps me think through what is a really broad, diverse, diffuse threat. I tend to think about it in 3 different levels. One, at a very local level, that is certainly not a good thing, but it's not a concern necessarily to the United States or its interests. That local problem can gravitate to more of a regional context where there can be threats against US embassies or the private sector. Witness what we saw in Mozambique last year. And ultimately, that threat can attempt to reach out and touch the United States, and that's obviously what we're most concerned about. Our track record here isn't great. We missed Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula when we thought that was more a regional problem before Umar Farouk Abdul-Talib and the Christmas Day bombing in 2009. And similarly, Faisal Shahzad, who was trained by TTP before he attempted to blow up a car in Times Square. We thought that was a local regional problem. So we need to be really careful. The question for me is whether we have adequate collection and analysis to be able to determine when the threat migrates from local to regional to national. So it's a question of risk and how much are you willing to accept, as you say, with the gravitation to great powers and the movement of collection and analysis away from CT. We just need to be very open-eyed about what the level of threat is. On the DT side, it's a little bit different for me. That has been primarily, again, individuals conducting attacks in the United States, not group-oriented, mostly right-wing, a little bit of left-wing. And there are just a host of issues that are going to make that really complicated for us to deal with. First Amendment concerns, to be sure. Just the individual or cell nature of the problem is challenged. but perhaps most importantly, is just the very definition of terrorism as politically motivated violence. So long as you see the kind of polarization that we've got in this country, I fear that we are almost certainly going to be seeing increased political violence in the United States.
So you mentioned complacency as a key threat to our ability to deal with counterterrorism, and that we want to avoid complacency. But now, as you mentioned, we are sort of going from the global war on terror to great power competition. Do you see any signs that we are in fact becoming more complacent with counterterrorism, especially as we see this sort of spread and this presence of ISIS-K in Afghanistan and so on?
I think that it's fair to say that we're a bit of a victim of our own success. That because there hasn't been large-scale attacks. I mean, hell, if you'd asked me the day after 9/11, if we could go 20 years without a major successful externally directed attack in the United States, I would have taken that in a heartbeat. So, I mean, there's a lot of good news because the government has done a lot of really good things. We've certainly made some mistakes as well. But I think it's fair to say that over the last 3 or 4 years, the country is reevaluating its risk equation. That is perfectly appropriate. When Secretary Mattis wanted to move resources from CT to other problems, I actually thought that was the right answer. We just need to be careful the way we do it. And I think there have been ongoing efforts to look at the CT enterprise over time. I think that will continue. As you suggest, the ISIS-K problem, and in general, I think Afghanistan, as a result of the pullout, is going to cause the community to look hard at sort of what our posture is and how we move forward.
So Russ, we've focused a lot on the podcast about counterterrorism in this past month. We had Gina Bennett on, the CIA analyst, and we just had Farah Pandith on to talk about radicalization and countering violent extremism. But I do want to focus on the idea of improving counterterrorism. And so are we too focused on the symptoms instead of the root causes of counterterrorism? We talked to Gina Bennett about addressing the root causes, and we did so similarly with Farah Pandith about how we need there needs to be a more robust effort within the U.S. government, particularly to engage with kind of local level leaders, both in the United States and around the world, to ensure that we can increase our de-radicalization and countering efforts.
Yeah, and I'm a big fan of both Gina and Farah's, and I do agree with them. I think that, after 9/11, I think we've probably done 5 national counterterrorism strategies, and there was a large degree of consensus very early on that we needed to do a bunch of things. We needed to take the fight overseas. We needed to work with partners and share lots of information. We needed to push borders out for the purposes of security, and we needed to make the homeland inhospitable for terrorists, and we needed to do terrorism prevention. I would argue that we've probably been a lot better at the first 4 and not as good at the last. And that's a problem because we did, I think Farah may have said this, in my view, certainly, we lost control of the narrative very quickly after 9/11. And there was a view that, well mistaken, widely held within many of the Muslim faith, that we were conducting a war on Islam. And that's a problem. We have orders of magnitude more people who are radicalized now than were the case after 9/11. And this is just a really hard problem. There's no cookie cutter approach. If you look at kind of radicalization in Africa, there's a lot more field research and survey data and one-on-one discussions with people who used to be terrorists, how they got where they were. And it's local conditions. There's a lot of concerns about government overreach and human rights violations and just general governance issues, and certainly poverty as well. But on the other extreme, if you look at something like Sri Lanka, the Easter attack, That was a very middle class group of individuals who were radicalized by a hate preacher. And so we've got to work across that entire swath. And I will say that, in my opinion, globally, we're not all that good at it. We've wasted a lot of money at throwing at attempts at dealing with corruption and governance and so forth. But that is some of the underlying causes with which we'll need to deal. Places like the UK, I'm actually a fan of the conceptual approach to the UK's PREVENT program. But as we saw a couple of weeks ago with the murder of the individual who had been a member of parliament, that guy had apparently been in the PREVENT program. And certainly that was the case with one of the London Bridge attackers from a year or two ago. So there's no perfect solution here. We absolutely got to deal with the social media problem. I think, to be fair, our social media companies have come a long ways over the last several years. But as you're hearing in many of the Facebook conversations on the Hill, they got a very long ways to go. Inside the United States, DHS has been working this problem hard in conjunction with the Bureau and the National Counterterrorism Center. They've gotten a good bit more money, but we do know that radicalization is a very personal issue. And I guess, in my view, the data supports the notion that 70% of all attacks, somebody knew about what was going on. So it could have been a teacher, could have been a family member, could have been a soccer coach. And we need to build the kind of trust that will cause these people to come forward and talk to the relevant authorities. So in general, with I'm very much with where Gina and Farah are, because frankly, unless you believe that this fervor is going to burn itself out, and I see no indication that that's the case, then we absolutely need to be dealing with causes.
So sort of jumping off of that, and on that Sri Lanka example with the Easter bombings, after those Easter bombings had happened, they had sort of, I think, came close, or they completely eliminated that terror cell, but the government had taken some actions against Muslim communities that were considered by some to be more Islamophobic. And of course, then you might have this cyclical thing going on where,
Exactly.
People in the Muslim community might become radicalized because they see the government attacking them. And in dealing sort of bilaterally and then multilaterally with some of these countries that may not have the best human rights records, but in working to counterterrorism, how do we balance sort of those needs, those goals, but also advancing democratic interests?
Yeah. Well, if you've got the answer to that, you've got the Nobel Peace Prize wrapped up, I think. Look, there is no school solution here. Obviously, the countries that we work with, we insist on human rights, so Leahy amendments and that sort of thing, in order to avoid those kinds of problems. I worry that, for instance, with the decline in some of the U.S. force posture in Africa that was intended to help teach militaries sort of appropriate approach and do kind of training and that sort of thing. When we vacated, we saw Wagner come into places in Africa, and they take exactly the opposite approach. And unfortunately, this notion of, what's sometimes called insurgency math, you kill one person and you end up having multiple more individuals radicalized. We're going to have to get that balance, and we don't have it right yet.
So Russ, I want to talk about the counterterrorism institutions and structures within the U.S. government. We haven't really delved into that too deeply on the podcast before. We have, of course, talked about CT and all the institutions that have been stood up, but you were principal deputy director and acting director of the NCTC, which is a body, an organ within the ODNI. And so I'd love for you to kind of explain to our listeners how this organization came to be and what its mission is, so that we can kind of understand the structural approach to CT in the U.S. government.
Yeah, after 9/11, there was a good bit of stock taking that occurred across the government, think tanks on the Hill. And while I don't like the metaphor, the notion was we quote unquote failed to connect the dots. Well, that's an overly simplistic sort of view of how analysis works. It does highlight the problem that we had lots of different organizations with lots of different data sources. We didn't have the relevant organizations talking to one another. And as a result, a couple of hijackers fell through the crack. So the sort of decision that was taken, heavily informed by the work being done by the 9/11 Commission, was that we needed to have an organization in the United States government that would have access to all relevant data and would do issues of common concern. We wanted to have a single authoritative database of known and suspected terrorists, as opposed to 4 classified terrorism databases that we had before 9/11. And we wanted to have a single watch list. We didn't want to have 13 watch lists, which we had before 9/11. So the school solution that came out of all of our study was that the National Counterterrorism Center was born, originally called the Terrorist Threat Integration Center, and it was as much an idea as it was an organization. And the notion was, John Brennan, the first director, called us an interagency joint venture. That is, he had me as one of the deputies from the Defense Department, but he had a principal deputy from FBI. He had another deputy from the National Security Agency. He had many seniors from the Central Intelligence Agency. And so we brought together people from across the government, embedded them in the first TTIC and then NCTC to work with the rest of the departments and agencies. Now, there was a problem originally on, I think, in that NCTC was additive to the rest of the community. That is, CIA continued to do its thing, DIA continued to do its thing, FBI, and so forth, which was okay. Probably not good government, but it was the path of least resistance, so that you didn't get the bureaucratic antibodies. It worked okay when there was a lot of money. But back to Andre's question, as we move forward, there's going to be less money for counterterrorism. And so the question is, how do we organize ourselves in the best possible way with the organizations we've got? How do we rationalize moving forward? And that is, I think, still up in the air. When I was the director of NCTC, that was when Secretary Mattis put out his national military strategy, saying that we needed to move a little bit away from CT, or at least needed to be addressing other threats. I agreed with that entirely. As I said, I also thought that actions have consequences. And so that we needed, as a counterterrorism enterprise, to see if we could get ahead of that problem. I was ostensibly the mission manager for Counterterrorism Intelligence Enterprise. And so we started an effort to look at how we best move forward. Both the first 2 directors of national intelligence that I worked for, Dan Coates and Joe McGuire, were completely on board with that, and we were moving forward. But the latter 2 DNIs that were brought in really weren't interested. One of them fired me, which led to my first retirement. And I sent a whistleblower complaint to the Hill, because I believe this issue is so important that it feels to me like we run the risk of moving back to almost a pre-9/11 structure if we are not supporting NCTC and we're moving back to a kind of a department and agency primary construct. I think that that's going to have significant implications. So we as a government need to ensure that we agree with where we're going and how we're going to get there. And I think there's probably some work that needs to be done.
Following up on that, you wrote an article last year in Just Security that talked a bit about the national security community's, quote, whole of government deficit. So we've had so many conversations about the pros and cons of the post 9/11 sort of intelligence community structure. But how do you see this problem? And can you sort of define what this whole of government deficit actually is?
Yeah, for me, it's a really big deal. It gets to sort of how our government organizes itself to deal with problems. And I am a form should follow function kind of guy. And the function to me is we need to be able to deal with really complicated threats in a globalized world that has blurred all kinds of distinctions, not the least of which is foreign and domestic, but also threats now transcend any one department or agency. They implicate multiple equities. So question, how do you deal with that? I think terrorism is actually the example that we've come the furthest on, but think about transnational crime or cyber or counterintelligence or counterproliferation, or even in the great power arena, in the case of foreign malign influence or Russia mucking with elections or China patent infringement, intellectual property theft. All of those issues implicate multiple departments and agencies. And so how do you deal with that? And for me, the deficit is not so much on issues that are on the front page of the New York Times. We will get the department agency seniors at the White House working with the National Security Council, and we'll work our way through. The problem is on the next door tier, I think, because and those sorts of issues, and those that I dealt with in the article, we missed 9/11 because we had a screening and vetting architecture that the plumbing didn't work. Well, that's not exactly a front burner issue. Or where do electrons go in different classified networks? Well, we missed that, and that gave rise to the embarrassments of WikiLeaks, and then a much harder problem, much more strategic problem with Snowden. And then similarly with pandemics and sort of the lack of PPE and sort of surveillance of the spread of disease and testing, all that sort of thing, that we just weren't ready for COVID. And so the question for me is how do you deal with those? And frankly, I just don't think we're very good at it. We've talked about it for 30 years, but we've never wanted to take on sort of the real challenges associated with how the government's organized. Bob Gates, in a piece last year, said our whole of government effort was smoke and mirrors, and I agree with that. I just think that's an accurate characterization. His answer was empower the State Department for all these overseas issues. That for me implicates major authorities questions, and that would be a bloodbath. So that may be the right long-term answer, but it isn't going to happen quickly. We saw in the last administration sort of the opposite, which was kind of kick problems out of the White House and let departments and agencies sort of self-organize and get things done. Well, that didn't work. So I think I'm someplace in the middle. I've done 3 tours on the NSC at the senior director level or higher. I am of the view that that's where the interagency needs to come together. I would argue that we should be a little bigger than we are, but there's no great appetite for increasing the size of the NSC. There's a sense that there's too much micromanagement. Maybe when I was there 4 or 5 years ago at the tail end of the Obama administration, I was one of 2 senior directors in the Trans-Border Directorate. And at the time, we had responsibility for the Southwest border, and we did screening and vetting, we did information sharing, we did transnational crime, we did foreign fighters. It's a really broad portfolio. And Amy Pope and I split the responsibilities. So you fast forward now, there is a single senior director in the Trans-Border Directorate. A fabulous officer, but you don't do more with less, you do less with less. And so we're going to need to decide how concerned are we about these problem sets and whether or not we're going to have the institution to work them at the NSC. My view would be, as I say, at the very least, I think you should have 2 senior directors for each account. But I also think that, as I said earlier, I think NCTC is the right model for the government, because even if the NSC was a little bigger, you're still going to have incredibly complicated problem sets. And you need somebody worrying the problem 24/7, an interagency effort below the level of the White House. I think that the NCTC model could be, to varying degrees, replicated for a bunch of these national security threats, and that we would be far better off because we would have people from the entirety of the interagency trying to work them regularly. Last point, I guess I would also suggest that we haven't looked hard at this problem now since before the Obama administration. The last effort to look at whether or not we were working whole of government appropriately with something called the Program of National Security Reform back before President Obama came in office. I think it's time to take a hard look, whether it's the National Defense University or an FFRDC or someplace, get some senior level expertise to step back and look at whether we're doing this properly. Because I think this is going to come back to haunt us.
I think that's absolutely right. I mean, structure is crucial, and getting structure right certainly will keep us safer. And so you mentioned the cases of 9/11 and WikiLeaks/Snowden as far as illustrating this problem of integrating across the government. But I want to apply this to Afghanistan, something that has been quite a difficulty for the Biden administration. So I want to ask Russ, does Afghanistan fit as well into this? I mean, there's been reporting that has emphasized that the administration was essentially unprepared for the consequences of the U.S. withdrawal. And of course, you served on the NSC during this. Do you see this as being accurate?
No. I think Afghanistan was a different problem. Frankly, I can't imagine a problem getting more attention than Afghanistan did in the first 6-7 months of an administration. I think one of the key points, I think, as a factual matter, we need to remember that history didn't start on the 20th of January. The Trump administration did what they thought was right, but the sort of unilateral cuts and the sort of cutting the Afghan government out of the negotiations and the release of prisoners and the complete lack of planning for withdrawal. Initially, they wanted to be gone by the end of January, and then that was moved to May. It's certainly not everything about Afghanistan was the Trump administration's fault. There is 20 years worth of problems here, and that's why I very much am of the view that having a bipartisan study group go off and look at sort of what went wrong, what did we do right, it is something that I think is just, it should be done in terms of the lessons learned. But okay, so we inherited what I think was a really bad hand that we had to play. There were no good options. We looked hard at whether we stay, whether we go. We used the phrase regular order, as in that it was both sides had ample opportunity to lay out their case. I was of the view initially that we should stay, partly because of CT, partly because of humanitarian. But at the same time, I also completely acknowledge that if we'd stayed, we would have been back at war, and there would be a lot of dead Americans. And so, impossible choice. So I honestly, I have no problem with the decision that was made. And frankly, given how rapidly collapse occurred, it might have been the right answer. But decisions made, we start a phased withdrawal. Throughout that time, one eye was on the Taliban advance. There were, I think, 19 warnings that went out to American citizens that you better get out of the country because things are going to get worse. The IC projections in terms of the march on Kabul kept getting shorter and shorter. And so the Defense Department did its prudent thing, and it was flowing forces into the region so that it could support a NEO if it came to that. I think I believe everyone who has testified has said nobody thought that we were going to see collapse within 11 days of the NDSF. And so the NEO got started under somewhat rocky conditions, to be sure. NEOs are always going to be precarious, particularly in a war zone. Things perhaps could have gone smoother, as I say. I think that's worth a study to take a look at. Frankly, I find the hypocrisy from some of our predecessors in the previous administration kind of inappropriate, because I think that we did about as well as could occur, given the situation we inherited, and trying to adapt to the conditions on the ground.
So you joined the Biden administration very recently as Deputy Homeland Security Advisor, and you sort of, I guess, anticipated spending most of your time focusing on counterterrorism. However, with the withdrawal and the aftermath of this, I mean, you were given quite a massive task, I'd say, to oversee the evacuation of the Afghans and sort of coordinate the Special Immigrant Visa program. So let's sort of start with an overview of that SIV program. There have been concerns raised about it. Can you give us a bit of the history of it, the origin, eligibility, and some of these challenges? How well did the government perform?
Sure. So I think the SIV program dates to 2006, I believe. Originally started for Iraqis who had supported our effort during the war, and then also for Afghans. So individuals like translators and interpreters are those that I think get the that's generally who's equated with SIVs, but it's actually much broader in terms of it could be people who worked at the embassy, it could be people who had badge access to US military facilities, but in general, the feeling was that we needed to help those who helped us. And before this evacuation, there were probably, we were approaching 100,000 people, I think, between Iraqis and Afghanis. As you suggest, Andre, it is a bureaucratically cumbersome exercise to get an SIV. If you try to imagine yourself, you're in the middle of Afghanistan. You might speak English. You might have access to a computer. You've got to go online and you've got to fill out a lengthy application process that is addressed to a place up in New Hampshire called the National Visa Center. And some of that application process includes you, the applicant, tracking down both the entity for which you worked. So it could be a government contractor who has long since left Afghanistan, may not even exist anymore, but it's your responsibility to find that contractor and get a letter that says you gave faithful service to the US government. Moreover, you have got to find a supervisor, probably would be a military officer, and you need to get a letter of recommendation from that person. Well, the military cycled through Afghanistan regularly, so that person could have gone on and it could be 3 tours later, someplace else. But all of that was part of the initial application process that an SIV who had provided until recently 2 years of faithful service to the USG. Well, that New Hampshire entity prepares a package, and it then migrates to the Afghan SIV office, which is part of the State Department. And they then start going through that entire package. And they've got to validate everything that's in there to make sure that you were who you said you were, and you had done all the things you said you'd done, and all the letters were legit and so forth. If that's the case, and you move to the chief of mission process, you have got to get petition a visa through part of the Department of Homeland Security out in Nebraska, who will then process your paperwork, more paperwork that's requested from you. It goes back to the New Hampshire entity. And if everything's moving okay, you will then get scheduled for an interview with the embassy. You'll go into the embassy, you'll have a short talk. And again, where do you live? Someplace in Afghanistan. You've got to get to Kabul, get to the embassy. You will have your interview. You will then be subjected to a lengthy screening and vetting effort by the intelligence community, law enforcement community, because obviously we want to make sure that we are bringing people who are vetted to the United States. Assuming you pass that, you'll then have to get to a medical so that you're not bringing contagious diseases to the US. You'll then get on an airplane and come to the US. Okay, so really complicated process. And here again, we received from the Trump administration a process that frankly was still pretty broken. They did State Department did an IG investigation at the tail end of the Pompeo regime that said basically this is an under-resourced effort, and there's not sufficient level of effort across the U.S. government. So we took that on board. It became our problem on the 20th of January. President Biden signed an executive order within the first week saying we're going to address this. The whole issue of vulnerable Afghans was being looked at while we made the decisions about withdrawing or staying. And then once the decision to withdraw was made, I held an interagency meeting the next day. And I've rarely been as impressed with the entirety of the interagency as I was in that meeting, because everybody was of the view that the SIV program generally, the issue of vulnerable Afghans in general, was a moral imperative for the country, that we owed these people and we needed to work this process. So we got going. And departments and agencies appointed SIV coordinators very quickly to sort of harness efforts within departments and agencies. Most importantly, we surged resources. And so we sent people to Kabul to work in the embassy. The embassy, frankly, the heroes in this process. What they did was just absolutely extraordinary. So more consular officers went to embassy, and I think the State Department quadrupled the number of people that were working SIVs. That's how under-resourced we were. And we streamlined some of the letter stuff. We improved screening and vetting. And so all of the issues that were identified, we used the Pompeo IG report as kind of a guide. Here's everything that needs to get fixed. And by the end of May, we had reduced what was generally viewed as an 800-day plus problem down to something in the 9, 10, 11-month process. We also worked with the Hill to see if we could further reduce it. So again, I think good government, that was certainly the effort. But we've got the Taliban advancing, and so the view was that it's still going to be too slow. And so in June, the decision was made by the president that we would begin flying people out early and finishing up their SIV processing. Question, where do you fly them to? We couldn't find any place outside the United States that would take them, so they had to come to the US, which meant that we needed to be taking people who were the closest to being fully vetted. And that's what gave rise to Operation Allied Refuge. We stood up a task force and under Tracy Jacobson at the State Department, and began flying people to the US in late July. We started with a flight every 3 days, went to a flight every 2 days, got to a flight every 1 day, and just as Kunduz fell and the Taliban started to surround Kabul, we were supposed to go to 2 flights a day, and we never made it to that. By that point, we had flown a couple thousand people out. They were moving through Fort Lee and then being processed for relocation to different parts of the country. We went then from kind of an orderly process with the SIVs to the kind of mass evacuation that you saw, and no question it was a rocky couple of days as the military got things organized. But the heroic efforts by the State Department to work the diplomatic arrangements on where we could put people before we brought them to the United States, and then the military airlift, which is like nothing this world has ever seen before. It was that impressive logistics operation. Do I wish we could have gotten more people out? For sure. We got 64,000 people out, 64,000 Afghans out, half of whom are children. And as I wrote in my farewell note to my interagency partners, that anyone should take the opportunity to get to one of the safe havens at the half dozen military posts. You will not come away with a dry eye. I mean, this is America at its best, I think. And importantly, for the future, the infrastructure is not only in place, it's further expanded. so that we can get more people out as the negotiations with the Taliban continue.
I mean, Russ, it really is an extraordinary undertaking. And so thank you for providing that kind of walkthrough of the process, just because I feel like most Americans and most people listening to our podcast are unaware about how this works and the efforts that the administration has been taking and is still taking. But I do want to talk about resettlement. And so there are, of course, tens of thousands of Afghan evacuees. But what happens once they get to the United States? So what does the resettlement in the U.S. look like, and how has it progressed?
Yeah, and recognize I'm now 5-6 weeks out of date, but you're quite right. So we flew them out of Afghanistan, and they went to places that were affectionately called lily pads, both in Europe and the Middle East, where they'd go through some vetting, they would get shots and so forth, and then they would be brought to the United States. The military had to surge to get places where they could go. So it's like Fort Bliss and Fort McCoy, a couple of places, Fort Lee, Quantico, and so forth. So I think 6 or 7 places within the U.S. Very much a whole of government effort as we transition from Operation Allies Refuge to Operations Allied Welcome. So it now comes under the Department of Homeland Security as the lead federal agency for the processing here in the States, but truly whole of government. The Defense Department, State PRM, Health and Human Services, AID, and Department of Homeland Security, all involved with these individuals. And in some of the bases, there's probably a couple thousand people, and in others, there's upwards of 10,000 people. And they have, and of course, just as I was leaving, we had a measles outbreak, and so that had to slow everything down in terms of being able to process people either into the United States or getting them off the military reservations and turned over to the resettlement organizations. But not only is this kind of whole of government federal, it's really whole of society, because we've now got what is very much a public-private partnership here with the voluntary agencies, and there are 9 of them, the big ones that work resettlement. There are private sector involvements, there are religious institutions, and so they are the ones that will take charge of moving the people off of the military bases, working with IOM, and getting them resettled around the country. And now you involve the state and locals. My guess is you've probably got neighborhood associations, and you've received emails about individuals who are collecting for the Afghan refugees. I will say that it's really been quite, it makes you feel good, because the American public, I think, is embracing this problem. It is going to be a very heavy lift. Again, 64,000 people that are flowing through these military bases and moving out to our state and localities around the country. There's a lot of work to be done, for sure. And there are going to be continued bumps. The infrastructure for refugees had atrophied in a big way over the last several years. And so we're trying to build that up. So this is going to go on a while. But it is just absolutely critical that we help these people get settled and sort of reestablish their lives here in the United States.
So we began today's conversation by discussing the terrorism threat, but what other threats really occupy your mind? I mean, what do you see as the greatest threats to our national security?
So I was an intelligence officer for 43 years. My overwhelming focus obviously was on external threats. And so I did a lot of Russia stuff, I did China stuff, I did the war in Iraq, I mean, all the kind of traditional national security threats. When I was the director of the National Counterterrorism Center, we would often have universities come through, and students would come to NCTC, and we'd just sit down and talk to them about sort of the state of terrorism. And invariably, I'd get a question somewhat similar to that. What did I view as the number one threat to the United States going forward? And I think I probably surprised a lot of the young people in that it wasn't a Russia problem or a China problem. I did say I was very worried about climate change. But my number one concern was whether our country could govern itself going forward. And it felt to me then, it feels even more to me now that we've got some significant challenges going forward. And I approach this kind of like an intel officer would approach a warning problem. I mean, warning is kind of what the IC does. And it's looking at kind of objective conditions and data and trends moving forward. And I think in every condition, I'm kind of worried about this. And the fragility of democracy is not a new issue. We've been talking about that for 225 years. I mean, from Franklin's statement about it's a republic if you can keep it. And the notion of factions that were written about in the Federalist Papers and the requirement of an informed American public to send wise people to Washington to govern. You know, I think we got some problems across the board there. And then we got a host of long-term realities, kind of the legacy of our original sin and difficulty dealing with race. We don't have an agreed history in this country. I mean, I think sociologists will tell you that maybe 70 or 80 million Americans were taught with textbooks that were sort of imbued with the lost cause narrative. We've tried to do history, a sort of basic history that would be taught in our K through 12, and we couldn't agree to it. So textbooks are all over the map. We've got an anti-intellectual bent in this country that Richard Hofstadter talked about in the 1960s. It's a lot of what we see behind some of the conspiracy theory stuff. And unfortunately, I think it's fair to say that both parties have failed the American people in significant ways. Everything from opioids to Flint water and a gazillion other issues. At a time when there are legitimate hard questions that the political parties need to be sorting out. Things like the individual versus the collective. What's the right balance as we work our way going forward? What is big government that is supposed to be this boogeyman? Sociologists have raised some questions about that. It feels to me like we never get to the point of actually talking about having an informed conversation about some of these really hard questions. And oh, by the way, we've just got a dizzying array of sort of the world around us, from COVID to demographic changes to social media and disruptive technologies. So is it any surprise that all of the polling data says polarization is increasing, that we're seeing a decline in empathy and compassion, that we're seeing a growth in income disparity, that we're seeing a decline in social mobility, and institutions across the board are suffering. All three branches of government and the press are at historically low numbers. Now, question is that going to get any better? It feels to me like we have almost a witch's brew of problems that are out there. Spend some time listening or reading about what's going on in the Charlottesville trial and the sort of vile stuff that's being spewed. There's been a normalization of bigotry and increased acceptability of political violence manifested in January 6th. I worry that we're seeing some suggestions that we're going to see reciprocal violence that could spiral. We do have, I fear, just a general at times lack of integrity among some of our politicians. Listen to what they said on the 6th and 7th of January and listen to what they're saying now and kind of the revisionist history that we're seeing. I think some are actually getting a little bit nervous because they've unleashed a bit of a mob, as you saw with anti-vax kind of stuff. Lindsey Graham gives a speech and says we need to vax, and he gets shouted down by it. We're seeing similar things go on at school boards. And unfortunately, I think some of this is very much by design. And if you listen to what Mr. Bannon has said, he's not concerned about the Democrats, he's concerned about the press. And so we're going to flood the zone with shit. And there's a conscious effort to confuse people. And so attacks on the free press are not new. They go back 40 years. But fake media, attacking science, what are facts? And we're seeing, I think, an attack on one of the preeminent checks on bad stuff happening, and that is the administrative state. You know, this nonsense about sort of just the thought that the government is inherently bad. That's playing out with elections and sort of the newest gerrymandering efforts and voter suppression, and somewhat below the surface, unlimited spending in support of libertarian positions that are motivated solely by a desire to diminish anything that is going to regulate the free market. It is that free market that has given rise to that other problem of climate change, by the way. But it's impacting our national politics and down ballots and judges and even school boards. And none of this is new. Sociologists and academics and investigative reporters and even some thoughtful politicians have been raising concerns about this. But give me one example where it's getting better. And I do not see a forcing function. That, if there's any good news at all, it's that by and large, the American public still believes that the values enshrined in the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution are that's the right answer. They generally support immigration. They will generally support affirmative action if past prejudice is having current effects. They believe that there's too much money in politics, but they're worried about the American dream. They're worried about democracy. And in that regard, I guess my concern is that, well, I want to put the faith in the American public. I don't think that we're not giving them a chance. They're not blameless because they have got responsibilities at a minimum level of sort of knowledge, but between an education system and teacher pay and sort of lack of investment in civics and critical thinking, the trends aren't good. And so you go back to the kind of the frailties of democracy anyway, what Jefferson was talking about, what Federalist 10 was talking about, informed citizenry that would elect wise people. And we're electing people that don't know what the three branches of government are. We're electing people who are adherents to QAnon. So again, what's the forcing function for why this gets better? Historians have talked forever that we don't have a common past. Question, can we forge a common future? And I will say, I think that is going to be the single biggest issue that your generation is going to have to deal with, because we are a long ways from being there. Long-winded answer. That's my concern, my biggest threat.
Oh, well, it's certainly, I mean, I don't know how you sleep at night with all of that in your head, but Russ, I completely agree with you. And something that you hit on, just basically the idea that who is the onus on? Is it a top-down problem or is it a bottom-up problem? And so I guess that just one final question for you today, it seems like from the top-down level, you're going to ostracize half the country. And so one half's going to say it's too political. The other half's going to say this is just right, and vice versa. And so because, I mean, the younger generation, Andre and myself, our generation, maybe some older than us, is it on the individual and I guess a collective of us from the bottom up to enact change? Because I don't see a path forward, at least in my head, where it will actually work out effectively from the top down.
Yeah, I agree with you. There are initiatives out in the hinterlands at some of the universities about trying to bring people together with different views, and some goodness comes from that. I mean, I think people do recognize that the other guy really isn't the enemy. We may not agree entirely, but that there is common cause, again, built around the basic values of who we think we are as a country. But I too fear that it's the top-down approach. It feels to me like that is just a recipe for greater polarization. I believe, I mean, go back and read President Biden's inaugural address. It was all about bringing people together. I mean, I absolutely believe that's what he wants to do. I think there are some Republicans that share the view that the middle in general, but there are problems on both the extreme left and extreme right that for the time being looks to me like we're not going to see a lot coming out of the federal level.
On that note, Russ, thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate this conversation. And I mean, how are you enjoying retirement after this massively long career? You're talking about so many threats. I hope you're finding some time to relax.
I'm doing a lot more reading, and that's certainly pleasant. And I hope I'm going to do some teaching and just in general be able to reflect a little bit more. It is perhaps the single biggest drawback at the White House is that it is so reactive. And I mean, people your generation can handle 80 hours a week. I can't. I mean, I think that the notion of being able to work that long is not healthy. I know that I wasn't able to do it for many, many months. And so we got to figure out sort of what are the best processes to achieve good government. How do we do the integrated effort across the government? There's a lot of work to be done. So I think a full employment plan for you guys.
Well, thank you so much. That's something to look forward to completely.
All right, guys, a pleasure. Enjoyed it very much. Thanks.
Mhm.